When it comes to factory drag cars, one of the most popular and mysterious examples is Chevrolet's Impala Z11 package. Only about 50 of these cars were produced, and just a handful of those still exist, making them extremely rare and extremely valuable and very important pieces of drag racing history. And the one we're looking at today is a faithful recreation of Wally Bell's New York Shaker, which is by far the most well-traveled Z11 as it passed from owner to owner, state to state, but it ultimately met its demise in an Iowa scrapyard in the 1970s. So before I get too carried away, I want to say a huge thank you to all the people who have been researching these cars for years. There's a group of guys that just live and breathe these Z11 cars, but I wanted to just make sure everybody knows that this isn't my research, this is somebody else's research that has led to the history of this car. So let's go back to this car's earliest days, and that's when it was sold through Cobb Motor Company in Goldsboro, North Carolina. This car was originally sold in January of 1963, and it ran for a very short amount of time under John Hollingsworth. You'll see Big John lettered on the front fenders. You'll also see those 427 cubic inch designations on the fenders, very important part of the Z11 package. And you'll also see that this car had a very special hood scoop on it. Details are a little bit fuzzy during the early days because this car was owned for a very short amount of time by the original owner. It's said that James Cook was the original owner, and he sold the car just a few months after buying it. It went down into Georgia and became the Georgia Shaker, raced by Hubert Platt, who would later switch to Ford and continued to run Fords for many, many years. But for 1963, he raced this very special Z11 Impala. And it's said to have been owned by Alan Hyder during this time, or at least financially backed by Alan Hyder. You can see that the lettering has changed dramatically. It's got cross flags on the doors. It's got big Georgia Shaker on the quarter panel. You'll also see designations of Nally Chevrolet in Atlanta, Georgia, and Dino Don Nicholson is said to have prepared this car. So it had a few custom pieces that Dino Don was known for. In a couple of these shots, you'll see that it's got some long traction bars that run up toward the front of the car. That wasn't factory, that was added more than likely by Dino Don, and I'm sure Dino Don went through this engine and blueprinted it and got every ounce of horsepower you could get out of it. Hubert Platt started racing this car in the middle of the 1963 season, and he put it on tour in the Southeast. I mean, he was at multiple tracks a weekend, going from place to place for super stock meets, factory experimental classes, match races, anything he could do to go race this car, he was running it hard. And by the end of the 1963 season, he had struck his deal with Ford, so he was actually campaigning a Chevrolet and a factory-backed Ford at the same time for a very short amount of time. But eventually, he stuck with the Ford and sold the Chevrolet to Wally Bell. So by the time it had made it to Wally Bell, this car had been worked on pretty extensively, and you can even see, going back to the Georgia Shaker configuration, you can even see some damage because those aluminum fenders and aluminum bumpers were really fragile, and just leaning over them to work on the car would actually create dents and damage on those front fenders. So Wally freshened it up a little bit. He put his own lettering on there, New York Shaker, and left the cross flags. You can see the Monaco blue paint is still on there, and you can see that hood scoop had changed a little bit in that 1 year period. A couple other small changes, but for the most part, this still looked like a factory 63 Impala. So Wally raced the car in the Northeast during the 1964 season, and then he put it up for sale early in 1965. So the car sold to Jack Schaefer in Pennsylvania, and to our knowledge, Jack never raced this car. He actually ended up trading it for another 63 Chevrolet. He traded with Larry Mower and Gerald Reeder, and they had a 63 Biscayne two-door post that had a pretty potent combination in it. It was known as the Red Cloud. They traded cars. Larry and Gerald ended up with the New York Shaker car, and they repainted it red and named it Branded. Now, there's very few pictures of this car in this configuration, but there are even fewer pictures of its later configurations because this car was then sold to Harry Huntsberry in Maryland, and it was repainted white and named So Rare. So Harry Huntsberry raced it for a little while, sold it to another guy in Ohio. The car was wrecked, and they actually had to put another roof on it. And the only other evidence of this car are these fuzzy pictures when it was sitting in a barn. You can see the different colored roof, you can see the white paint, you can barely make out some of that lettering on the side, and you can even see some of the Monaco blue paint around the taillight bezel and headlight bezel area. But by this point, It was a pretty rough car. There wasn't a whole lot there to speak of, and the really sad part about this is due to some sort of family conflict, the car ended up getting scrapped. So by the time this car had finished its whole run, it had been in North Carolina, Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, and ultimately Iowa, where it went to the scrapyard and was never seen again. So the car we're looking at today, which was on display in the factory drag car exhibit at the Savoy Auto Museum in Cartersville, Georgia, this is a very faithful recreation built by Dennis Jackson a few years ago. It's not an actual Z11, but it does have very authentic Z11 parts. And that's going to give us an opportunity to talk about what makes a Z11 so special. And that is the aluminum body panels. So it's got aluminum fenders, it's got an aluminum hood, aluminum filler panel, and aluminum front and rear bumpers. So these cars were also ordered with no front sway bar. They were ordered with a very special 427 cubic inch engine, which was based on the already popular 409. So this looks like a 409, but it's actually 427 thanks to a 3.65 inch stroke on the crankshaft. So these things had 13.5 to 1 compression. They had very special cylinder heads. They had a 2-piece intake manifold with 2 4-barrel carburetors. And then that air cleaner pulls fresh air out of the cowl panel right down into the engine. But you'll notice that a lot of these cars ended up with custom hood scoops. So it's likely that a lot of these very special and very rare air cleaners ended up in the scrap pile back in the 1960s. These cars were rated at 430 horsepower, but we got to remember that the factories were being pretty modest about their horsepower ratings because most of the class designations were separated by advertised horsepower and the weight of the car. So realistically, these things probably made close to 500 horsepower in original form, but if they were blueprinted and gone through by somebody like Dino Don or Bill Jenkins, somebody like that could put these things way over 500 horsepower with just some little tricks. And they called it blueprinting, but you know, there were little tricks that you could do to the inside of these engines that would really free up a lot of horsepower. Behind the 427 is a T10 4-speed, and these cars also had very special brakes. These brakes came off of a Corvette Z06, which is a really rare car to begin with. But because of all this added horsepower, they put these bigger drum brakes on there, which required the use of 15-inch steel wheels instead of the factory 14s. Now there are conflicting reports of how many of these cars were actually produced. Some say 50, some say 57, but either way, it's an extremely rare car and there's just a handful of them that still exist. This car, the one we're looking at today, this recreation of Wally Bell's New York Shaker, is very authentic because it has a lot of original Z11 components on there. A lot of that factory aluminum stuff. I mean, that takes a lot of work to put that back into working condition. And luckily, Wally was able to see this car before he passed away in 2022. So it brought a big smile to his face, and it's brought a smile to a lot of people's faces because people remember the names on these cars. They remember how cool these cars were in 1963 and 64 and beyond, because these cars had personality. Even though there was 50 of them that were built very similarly, every car was a little bit different. So this one had its own personality, and Dennis Jackson did a good job of recreating that New York Shaker combination. All the hand lettering is beautiful. The finishes on this car are perfect. The stance is right on the money. This thing is a beautiful piece. And he ended up selling it to a collector in South Georgia. His name is Jerry Kelly. He's got a lot of other really neat stuff, including the Swiss cheese Pontiac that I featured in a previous video. But he allowed this thing to be on display at the Savoy Auto Museum for their factory drag car exhibit, which was an awesome display of really great and highly significant cars. I enjoyed walking through that, and I hope you enjoyed following along with me on the history of this car and taking a look at this really great recreation that Dennis Jackson put together. So stay tuned for more videos on historic drag cars. Thank you for watching.